Nobody is going to choose you, the woman behind her whispered, and Serena Voss did not turn around. She had learned long ago that turning around only gave people the satisfaction of seeing your face fall. She kept her eyes fixed on the enormous double doors at the far end of the corridor, the doors that led into the grand hall of the mating auction, the doors that in approximately 4 minutes would open and change every life behind them. The corridor smelled of expensive perfume and nervous sweat and the sharp, electric anticipation that always gathered when wolves were about to be assessed, ranked, and chosen. Serena smelled all of it and felt none of the excitement. She felt only the dull, familiar weight of being exactly where she did not want to be, wearing the only formal dress she owned, which was 3 years old and slightly too short at the hem, standing among women who had spent months preparing for this moment, while she had spent those same months pretending it was not. Coming. I heard she does not even have a wolf, another voice said, not bothering to lower itself. How do they even allow that? Is there not a minimum standard for the auction? The laughter that followed was quiet and practiced, the kind of laughter that had been refined over years of social gatherings where cruelty was dressed in silk and called commentary. Serena breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth. She counted the golden veins in the marble floor beneath her feet. She reminded herself that in a few hours this would be over, and she would return to her small room in the Voss clan house, and she would never have to think about the mating auction again, because no one was going to choose her, and she had long since made peace with that truth. She was 22 years old, an Omega by designation, the adopted daughter of Clan Voss, and she had never once in her life manifested her wolf. No shift, no heightened senses beyond the ordinary sharpening that came with pack proximity, no special abilities, no golden eyes in the dark. She was, in every measurable way that the werewolf world cared about, nothing. The Voss elders had brought her to the auction not because they believed she would be chosen, but because the accord required that every unmated female of eligible age from a registered clan be presented. To refuse was to invite fines and the loss of certain territorial privileges. So here she was. A formality. A body filling a required space in a corridor that smelled of ambition and jasmine. The double doors opened. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. The grand hall of the mating auction was circular and domed, its pale stone walls catching the afternoon light through a ring of high windows and scattering it in warm pools across a floor inlaid with silver in the ancient pack sigils of every major clan. The pattern spiraled toward a raised, central dais draped in deep blue silk that matched the Ashvale banners above. Those banners bore the mark of the ruling line that had governed the 5 territories for 600 years, and under that mark, every mating auction since the first accord had taken place. The female candidates were arranged in a long arc, each before a placard bearing her clan name and wolf classification. Serena found her place at the far end of the arc, where the light was dimmer, and the silver in the floor had worn to gray. Her placard read, Voss, Serena, Omega, unclassified. The unclassified designation was the polite way of noting the absence of confirmed wolf abilities. The woman to her right was from Clan Hartwell, with the kind of beauty that needed no enhancement. Long dark hair, pale green eyes, a posture so precise it seemed architectural, and a small gold chain at her throat. Her placard read, Hartwell, Isolde, Omega Prime. Ability, enhanced compulsion. Serena did not need to look at Isolde, directly to feel the weight of her presence. She radiated the specific energy of someone who had never once doubted that she deserved to be exactly where she was. The Alphas entered from the opposite side of the hall. There were 14 of them, each announced by the Accord's Master of Ceremony, with a recitation of territory, clan name, rank, and notable accomplishments. They ranged from the very young to the old and weathered. Serena watched each Alpha take his place in the observation arc, with the polite, neutral expression she had been practicing since childhood, feeling the weight of their collective attention against her skin like the pressure of a coming storm. Then the Master of Ceremony paused. He paused in a way that was entirely different from the natural pauses between announcements. He paused the way water pauses at the edge of a great drop, gathering itself, knowing what comes next. And every person in the grand hall felt it. That pause, that gathering, and turned. Their attention to the main entrance at the top of the hall, where the great carved doors, taller than 3 men stacked, had begun to open. His Royal Majesty, Dorian Ashvale, Alpha King of the 5 Territories, Lord of the Ancient Compact, Keeper of the Lunar Covenant. The voice of the Master of Ceremony carried the practiced resonance of someone who had spent decades learning how to fill large rooms with sound. But even so, the announcement felt insufficient. It felt like trying to describe an ocean by listing its water. Dorian Ashvale walked into the grand hall of the mating auction the way weather moved into a valley, not announcing itself, not asking permission, simply arriving and changing the quality of everything it touched. He was tall, which Serena had expected, and broad through the shoulders, which she had also expected. And his face was the kind of face that painters tried and mostly failed to capture, because the parts of it that mattered most were the parts that could not be held still long enough to study. His jaw was hard. His mouth was set. His eyes, amber in a way that suggested they might shift to gold under certain lights, moved across the room with the unhurried precision of someone who was not looking for anything in particular, because he had already assessed everything in general and found nothing surprising. He was 30, perhaps 31. Alpha King since the age of 24, when his father's death in the territorial wars had placed the crown in his hands before anyone thought he was ready. He had spent 6 years proving everyone wrong in ways that occasionally bordered on ruthless. He had ended 2 interclan conflicts before they became wars, survived 3 assassination attempts, and emerged from each one with a slightly quieter manner and a slightly harder edge. He took his place not in the observation arc with the other alphas, but on the raised dais in the center of the room, the final authority, the one who would choose first. And choose alone. The Accord's traditional phrasing for this moment was spoken by the Master of Ceremony with its full ceremonial weight. His Majesty may choose to observe, or His Majesty may choose to select. The choice belongs to the King. And then there was silence. The specific silence of a room full of people holding their breath at exactly the same moment. And Dorian Ashvale stood on the dais and let his gaze move slowly along the arc of female candidates. Serena watched him from the corner of her eye the way one watches a fire, with caution, aware of the danger in looking directly. She saw his gaze move along the arc. She saw it slow near the center where the most distinguished candidates stood. She saw it pass over Isolde Hartwell, who straightened almost imperceptibly when those amber eyes touched her. And she saw the way Isolde's own carefully controlled expression shifted into something that was almost but not quite a smile. The expression of a woman who believed she was watching the beginning of an expected conclusion. And then Serena saw something she had not anticipated and would not have believed if she had been told to expect it. Dorian Ashvale's gaze continued moving. It moved past Isolde Hartwell. It moved past the Omega Prime from Clan Redditch, whose ability to predict weather patterns had made her a subject of considerable speculation among the alphas in the gallery. It moved past the twin sisters from Clan Ashmore, who stood with identical postures and identical expressions of composed expectation. It moved all the way to the end of the arc, to the dim end, to the place where the silver in the floor had worn to gray, and it stopped. It stopped on Serena. She felt it before she fully processed it, that amber gaze landing on her with the weight of something that had traveled a great distance to arrive. She felt it the way you feel a hand on your shoulder when you thought you were alone, sudden and disorienting and impossible to immediately classify as welcome or threatening. She made herself hold very still. She made herself breathe. She told herself he was simply completing his visual survey of the room, and his gaze had simply arrived at its natural endpoint, which happened to be her. And in a moment, it would move on. It did not move on. Dorian Ashvale stepped down from the dais. The sound of his footsteps crossing the inlaid floor was the only sound in the grand hall, because every person in the room had stopped breathing at exactly the same moment. Serena watched him approach with an expression she could not have named, because she had never in her life needed this particular expression before. The expression of someone watching an impossible thing happen in slow motion and being entirely unable to determine the appropriate response. He walked the full length of the observation arc. He passed every other candidate without pausing. He stopped in front of Serena. He was close enough that she could see the exact shade of his eyes, which were not simply amber but a layered, shifting amber, like sunlight through autumn leaves, with something darker at the center. He was close enough that she could smell him, pine and cold air, and something underneath both that she did not have a name for, but that seemed to reach inside her chest and do something to the rhythm of her heartbeat that she found immediately alarming. He looked at her for what felt like an entire geological age, compressed into approximately 4 seconds. "I choose her," he said. The voice was quiet. It was not theatrical. It was not the voice of a man performing a dramatic gesture for an audience. It was the voice of a man stating a fact that he had already known before he entered the room. A voice with no doubt in it, no hesitation, no performance. And the silence that followed those 3 words was the loudest thing Serena had ever heard. And then the mark appeared. It began at her collarbone. A warmth, first. The kind of warmth you feel when you step from shadow into sunlight, and then heat, and then something that was beyond heat, something that had no precise sensory name, but that she felt in every cell of her body simultaneously. A burning that was not painful in the way fire is painful, but was instead precise and purposeful, as though something that had been sleeping inside her for 22 years had just opened one eye. She looked down at her own skin, visible above the neckline of her dress, and she watched the mark form there, silver white against her skin, a sigil she had only ever seen in history books. A circle quartered by a cross, each quadrant holding a phase of the moon, crescent and half and gibbous and full, and in the center of the circle, the ancient symbol of the Ashvale bloodline, the wolf and the crown rendered in lines so fine they seemed to have been drawn by light itself. The royal mark, the mark that had not appeared on living skin in 3 generations, the mark that, according to the Accord's oldest texts, could only manifest on one person, and that person was always, without exception, the true heir to the Ashvale throne. Somewhere above her in the observation gallery, she heard someone make a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a word. And then she heard a second sound, which was the very specific quality of silence that follows a revelation so large that human language briefly ceases to function in its presence. Beside her along the arc, she heard Isolde Hartwell draw a breath that was sharp enough to cut glass. Dorian Ashvale looked at the mark on Serena's skin. His expression did not change. Or rather, it did not change in any way that could be called surprise. Because the expression of a man who has just seen exactly what he expected to see does not need to rearrange itself. Something moved in his eyes that was not surprise, and not satisfaction exactly, but something older than both of those things. Something that looked, if Serena had been in any condition to accurately read it, very much like recognition. "We need to leave," he said quietly. "Now." Serena looked up at him. She was aware that she was experiencing shock, the particular cognitive flatness that the mind creates when it receives more information than it can immediately process, the mental equivalent of a circuit breaker tripping. She was aware that the entire grand hall of the mating auction was staring at her. She was aware that the mark on her skin was still warm, still present, still entirely real, despite every reasonable argument against its existence. She was aware that the Alpha King of the 5 territories was standing approximately 18 inches from her face, and telling her they needed to leave. "I do not," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt it had any right to. "Understand what is happening." "I know," Dorian Ashvale said. "I will explain. But not here. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below." The room they moved her to was not grand in the way the rest of the Accord's venue was grand. It was a working room, wood-paneled, furnished with a large table and several chairs that had the worn quality of furniture that had been sat in by people with serious things to discuss. There was a fireplace that someone had recently lit, and the fire was the most normal thing Serena had seen in the last 20 minutes. Orange and ordinary, and completely indifferent to the fact that her entire world had just rearranged itself around her without asking permission. 2 guards stood outside the closed door. Inside the room there was only Serena, Dorian Ashvale, and a third person who had appeared from somewhere and who Serena had not fully processed yet. A compact, sharp-eyed man in his 40s, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades being the most prepared person in any given room. "Counselor Payne," Dorian said to the man, "would you give us a moment?" It was not a question. Counselor Payne looked at Serena with an expression she could not quite read, something between assessment and something else she had no name for, and then he left without speaking. The door closed. Serena stood in the center of the room and watched Dorian Ashvale move to the table and rest his hands on the back of a chair, and she recognized the gesture for what it was, the thing people do when they need a moment to decide exactly how to begin saying something they have known they would eventually have to say. "How long have you known?" she asked, because it seemed the most important question, and also because the steadier she kept her voice, the steadier she would remain, and she needed very badly to remain steady. He looked at her with those amber eyes. 6 weeks, he said. 6 weeks. Serena translated that into a timeline. 6 weeks ago, she had been in the Voss clan house, doing the administrative work that she had been doing for the past 3 years, managing the correspondence and supply records for a clan that had never quite known what to do with her, and had eventually settled on finding her useful, rather than valued. 6 weeks ago, the Alpha King of the 5 territories had known something about her that she had not known about herself. "How?" she said. "The Accord's archives," he said. "There is a section that has not been publicly accessible in 200 years. My father sealed it. I unsealed it 4 years ago after his death, and spent 2 years working through it before I found the relevant documents." He paused. He seemed to be choosing his next words with the care of someone diffusing something. "Your birth parents were not who you were told they were." Serena had been braced for many things in the last 20 minutes. She had not specifically braced for this, but she found that she was not, in fact, surprised, which perhaps meant some part of her had always known there was something missing from the story she had been given. She had been found, the Voss elders had always told her, left at the boundary of clan territory as an infant. No note, no identification, no explanation. They had taken her in because the Accord required it. She had grown up knowing she was a charity case and trying to be grateful for it. "Then who were they?" she said. And it was not quite a question because she was not quite ready for the answer to be real. But she asked it anyway. "Your mother was the Alpha King's younger sister," Dorian said. "My father's sister. Her name was Lena Ashvale. She disappeared 23 years ago. Everyone believed she had died. I believed she had died until I found the documents." He stopped. He looked at Serena with an expression that was perhaps the most unguarded thing she had seen on his face yet, which was not very unguarded at all, but was at least honest. She did not die. She ran. She was pregnant, and the man who fathered the child was not a wolf, and she knew what the council would do with that information. So she ran, and she left the child where she knew a registered clan would be required to take her in, and where no one from the Ashvale court would ever think to look. Serena stood very still and processed this information. She was not the adopted charity case of Clan Voss. She was the daughter of a woman who had chosen exile over submission, the niece of a dead king, the cousin of the man across from her who had walked the full length of a ceremonial hall to stand in front of her, because he had spent 4 years reading documents in a sealed archive. "What happens now?" she said. "That depends on what you want," he said. She looked at him then, a direct look, the kind she had learned not to give people in positions of power because direct looks invited direct scrutiny, and she had spent most of her life trying not to be scrutinized. But she looked at him directly now, because the situation seemed to call for it. "What I want," she said. has not been a meaningful variable. In most decisions affecting my life up until this point, something moved across his face. Not quite sympathy, which she would have found patronizing, and not quite respect, which she would have found premature, but something that contained elements of both, and perhaps something else. "It will be from this point forward," he said, "if you choose to step into what the mark means. And if I do not, then I return you to Clan Voss with an apology and a formal commendation that will considerably improve your standing within the clan, and the mark fades within a week of our separation, and your life continues as it was." He said this plainly, without making it an offer designed to be refused. "The choice is genuinely yours. I am not going to pressure you." Serena thought about returning to Clan Voss. She thought about the administrative work and the small room and the way the elders spoke to her with the specific kind of courtesy reserved for things you have taken responsibility for but do not particularly love. She thought about 22 years of being told in 100 subtle ways that she was not quite enough, and not quite real, and not quite the thing she was supposed to be. She thought about the mark on her skin and the warmth it had carried when it appeared, the warmth of something finally waking up. She thought about the woman who had left her at a clan boundary to keep her safe, and she thought about what it meant that the woman had been right to do it. And she thought about what it meant that the woman was gone now, and Serena was sitting in a wood-paneled room with a fire and an Alpha King who had unsealed archives and crossed a ceremonial hall to stand in front of her, and she thought that perhaps the only honest response to impossible situations was to keep moving forward into them rather than backward into the familiar. "Tell me what stepping into it means," she said, specifically. Dorian Ashvale sat down across from her and began to talk, and Serena listened. And outside the wood-paneled room with its ordinary fire, the grand hall of the mating auction was crackling with the kind of news that moves faster than fire through dry wood. Isolde Hartwell stood at the center of it, standing where she always stood, which was wherever the power was, and she listened to the whispers with an expression that showed nothing, because she had practiced showing nothing for so long, it had become her default state. Inside the composed expression, inside the silk and the gold chain and the Omega Prime designation, she was performing calculations. She was calculating what the mark's appearance meant for the arrangements she had spent 14 months putting into place, for the understanding she had reached with Counselor Payne, for the precise architectural future she had assembled stone by stone in her mind. It meant that structure was in danger. She smiled, which was what she did when she needed people to believe she was fine with something. She would deal with the reality of what she was going to do about the girl with the royal mark later, in private, where no one could watch her face while she made her decisions. "Extraordinary," she said to the woman beside her, and inside the smile she began to plan. Serena spent the next 3 days inside the Ashvale Court's residence facility, which was less grand than she might have expected, and more functional, practical rooms with the quiet efficiency of a place designed to house people who were working rather than visiting. She was given a suite overlooking a garden not quite in season, its bare branches showing only the promise of what they would become. She was assigned 2 attendants, Mara and Corvin, who were brisk and competent, and a guard named Joss who was 25, trained since childhood, and had learned to be invisible unless needed. She found his presence initially alarming, then irritating. Then, after 2 days, simply a fact of her new environment. Dorian was present sometimes, and absent others. He had 5 territories to run, and when he was present he was focused and precise, explaining to her the Accord structure, the history of the Ashvale bloodline, and the specific ways in which the appearance of the mark was going to complicate all of the above. He spoke to her as though she was intelligent and capable of handling complex information, both of which she found so reflexively surprising she had to consciously stop herself from showing it. The last time the royal mark appeared was 3 generations ago, he told her on the second day, in a small meeting room with windows and a pot of tea that Mara had brought, and that Serena was drinking because she had always found tea useful in situations that required her hands to have something to do. My great-grandfather's cousin. It was contentious then also, because it indicated a line of succession that certain members of the court did not prefer. What happened to the cousin? Serena said. Dorian looked at her steadily. She died young, he said. Serena set down her tea. I see. I am telling you this not to frighten you, he said, but because I believe you are the kind of person who makes better decisions with accurate information than with edited information. I am, she said. Who would want to prevent the succession? Anyone who benefits from the current structure, he said. The royal mark does not automatically confer the throne. The accord requires a claiming ceremony, a formal ritual in which the heir is publicly recognized and the bloodline is verified by the 5 territorial councils. That ceremony cannot happen without the agreement of a majority of the councils, and not everyone on those councils would prefer to see a new line of succession established. He paused. Councillor Payne, who serves as my senior advisor, is the most influential voice on the combined council. He has been the most influential voice for 15 years. He has been very good at his work. He is also, I have recently come to believe, the person most likely to want the claiming ceremony to fail. Serena absorbed this. He was in the room when I arrived, she said. You sent him out? Yes. Does he know you suspect him? He knows I am aware that the political landscape is complicated, Dorian said. He does not know the extent of what I know about his arrangements. I have been building a case carefully. The appearance of the mark has altered my timeline, which is inconvenient, but manageable. Serena thought about Councillor Payne's eyes on her face as he left the wood-paneled room. She thought about the thing she had not been able to name in his expression, and now could. Assessment. The careful clinical assessment of a threat that had materialized ahead of schedule. He will move quickly, she said. Dorian looked at her. Yes, he said, and there was in his voice something that was not quite surprise, but was a version of attention that felt different. From his usual operational focus, a sharpening. That is my assessment as well. You have good instincts. I have spent 22 years being underestimated, Serena said. You learn to read people carefully when you cannot rely on status or power to manage the situations they create. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not a smile exactly, but it was the shape a smile uses as a starting point. That is going to be an asset, he said. In what comes next? What came next arrived faster than either of them had planned for, because on the morning of the 3rd day, Serena woke before dawn with the mark burning against her skin, with a heat that was qualitatively different from the warmth it had carried when it first appeared. This was not the warmth of awakening. This was the heat of warning, and she lay in the dark of her suite for precisely 3 seconds, registering this distinction, before she was out of bed, and pulling on the clothes she had left draped over the chair, and crossing to the door where Joss stood in the corridor with the expression of a man who had heard her moving and was already oriented toward the problem. Something is wrong, she said. I know, Joss said. I was about to come in. There are people in the building who should not be here. He said it with the economy of someone trained to convey maximum information in minimum words, and Serena appreciated it because it meant they could begin moving immediately. They moved down the corridor, Joss ahead of her. Through a series of turns, she was memorizing now with the focused attention of someone who understood she was going to need this information, and came out through a service door into a courtyard that was cold and gray in the pre-dawn air and smelled of damp stone. Dorian Ashvale was already in the courtyard. He was not alone. 2 of his personal guards stood with him, and he was carrying in his left hand the kind of stillness that suggested he had been awake for some time and had already made several decisions before Serena arrived. He looked at her, and at Joss, and then at the mark visible at her collarbone, which was still burning with that warning heat, and he said, We need to get you to the northern residence. There are people in this building with orders I do not believe came from anyone with legitimate authority. Payne, Serena said. Almost certainly, he said. I have sent for verification. In the meantime, moving you is the safest option. How many people? She said. 4 that we have identified. Possibly more. Serena looked at him in the gray pre-dawn light and thought about the Voss clan house and the small room and the administrative work and the 22 years of being a person to whom things were done, rather than a person who did things. And she felt the mark against her skin. And she felt something else. Something that had perhaps always been there under the surface of everything she had believed about herself. Something that was waking up the way. The mark had woken up, not suddenly, but with the gathering inevitability of something that had always been going to happen. "Then let us move," she said. They moved. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. The journey to the northern residence took 4 hours and was made in a vehicle with darkened windows and an escort that changed twice at different waypoints along the route. She sat across from Dorian in the vehicle's interior, and they did not speak much, but the silence between them was not uncomfortable in the way silences between near strangers usually were. It was the silence between people who are each thinking carefully about a shared problem, and do not need to fill the air with words to establish that the problem is shared. She watched his face when he did not know she was watching. He was not handsome in the way that was designed to be looked at, which was actually a more interesting kind of handsome, the kind that required attention to find and rewarded it with specifics rather than impressions. The line of his jaw, the actual bearing of someone who had carried responsibility so long it had become part of their physical structure. She thought about the mating auction and what it had taken for him to walk the full length of that arc and stop in front of her. He had done it knowing the disruption it would cause, knowing the political complexity it would introduce, and he had done it anyway because the documents had told him who she was, and he had believed the documents and made a choice that was correct rather than convenient. She did not know what to do with that. She was not sure she had ever had a framework for what to do with someone who made correct choices on her behalf without being asked. The northern residence was built for defense first and appearances second, a stone structure set against a hill with the compact solidity of something that had grown from the ground rather than been placed on it. It sat within a territory that was technically neutral ground under the Accord's oldest provisions, meaning any action against persons sheltering within its boundaries was a violation of the Accord itself, not only of Dorian's authority. She thought about Councillor Payne and his 14 months of arrangements, and she thought about the royal mark on her skin, which had cooled somewhat during the journey, but had not fully returned to the warmth it had carried in those first hours after it appeared. She thought about the woman who had run from this court 23 years ago to keep her daughter safe from exactly the kind of people currently sending operatives to remove her before she could become a problem. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was not frightened. She was instead calm with the specific clarity of someone who has identified the problem precisely enough to begin thinking about solutions. In a room with maps on the walls and a table worn smooth by decades of serious conversations, Serena sat across from Dorian and said, "Tell me everything about Councillor Payne." He told her. It took 2 hours and covered 15 years of accumulated documentation that Dorian had been quietly gathering since he first unsealed his father's archives, and found the thread that, when he pulled it, had led him deeper and deeper into the structure of what Payne had built in the years since the old king's death. Payne had not acted against the kingdom. Not precisely. He had acted within it, steering decisions, managing information flows, cultivating alliances with the territorial council members most susceptible to cultivation, building a position so central to the court's functioning that removing him without cause would create a crisis larger than the one his presence was generating. He was the kind of political problem that required not a direct attack, but a very specific unraveling. "The claiming ceremony," Serena said, when Dorian had finished. "If it proceeds, and the mark is verified before the territorial councils, what happens to his position?" "It becomes significantly more complicated," Dorian said. "The ceremony establishes a second line of royal authority. Payne's influence rests partly on being the primary bridge between the Alpha King's office and the territorial councils. A second authority within the royal bloodline changes the structure of that bridge. He cannot prevent the ceremony entirely," Serena said. "The Accord's provisions are too clear, but he can delay it. And while it is delayed, other things can happen. Yes, such as the new line of succession becoming unavailable." Dorian looked at her directly. "Yes," he said again. and his voice carried in it the weight of someone who had been carrying this particular knowledge alone for longer than was comfortable. Which is why the timeline is what it is. Serena looked at the maps on the wall. She looked at the 5 territories marked in different colors and the lines between them that indicated the boundaries of alliance and adjacency, and the specific geographies of power in the world she had apparently been born into the center of without knowing it. She thought about the claiming ceremony and what it required: a formal gathering of the 5 territorial councils, a verification ritual, a public declaration. She thought about the complexity of convening such a gathering quickly enough to stay ahead of Payne's timeline. She thought about what she could offer to that effort that Dorian alone could not. There are council members who would not support Payne's preferred outcome but who would not necessarily act against him openly, she said. Because acting against him openly is costly, and the benefit has to be worth the cost. The appearance of the mark changes the calculation for some of them, but not all. Correct, Dorian said. But a direct appeal from the air, she said slowly, thinking as she spoke. From someone who has spent 22 years understanding exactly what it means to have no institutional power, and who can therefore speak to the experience of every wolf in those territories, who has also spent their life with no institutional power, that changes a different calculation. Dorian was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her with the quality of attention that she had noticed in him before, the sharpening. You are describing a political strategy, he said. I am describing what I have been doing my entire life, she said, which is finding the argument that connects to what the person in front of me actually cares about, rather than what they are supposed to care about. I have just never had anything real to argue for before. Outside the northern residence, the morning was moving into afternoon, and the rain that had been promised in the pre-dawn air was beginning to make good on its threat. A soft, persistent rain that darkened the stone of the building and made the light inside warmer by contrast. Serena looked at the Alpha King across the worn table and thought that this was perhaps one of the most unusual mornings she had ever experienced, which was saying something given the morning 3 days ago when she had stood in the mating auction with her ordinary dress and her unclassified designation, and the Alpha King had walked to the end of the arc and stopped in front of her. And then the most unusual morning in her life had simply continued to extend itself. The claiming. Ceremony requires 3 weeks of preparation under the Accord's provisions, Dorian said. We have 3 weeks to secure the council votes. Payne knows this as well as we do. Then we begin today, Serena said. He almost smiled. She was certain of it this time. The corner of his mouth, the slight deepening of the lines around it, the specific quality of something that had been held back, choosing to partially release. It was not a full smile, and she suspected that full smiles from this man were things he gave rarely and deliberately, but it was the beginning of one, and she found she was keeping careful track of it. Today, he agreed. The next 3 weeks were the most fully inhabited period of Serena's life, which was perhaps a strange way to describe what was also one of the most consistently alarming periods of her life, but both things were true simultaneously, and she found they did not cancel each other out. She spent mornings in strategic sessions with Dorian and the 2 advisors. They had identified as trustworthy Mara's older brother, who turned out to be not merely an attendant sibling, but a former territorial magistrate, and a sharp, careful woman named Tevin, who served as Dorian's personal archivist, and who had been quietly building her own documentation of Payne's activities for 8 years, without anyone asking her to. She spent afternoons in communications work, which was not meetings in marble halls, but letters written carefully and messages conveyed through channels that Payne's network did not have visibility into, reaching the territorial council members whose calculations she and Dorian had identified as movable. She also spent time doing something she had not anticipated, which was learning about the powers she had apparently always had. Tevin's archives contained documents describing the specific qualities of the Ashvale bloodline's gifts, which were not the obvious physical gifts of the shifted form, but the subtler, stranger gifts of what the oldest texts called deep sight and word truth. Deep sight was the ability to perceive the emotional and intentional reality beneath what was said and presented. Word truth was the ability to speak with a conviction that carried at the neural level of the listener. a resonance of authenticity that made deception impossible, not through compulsion as Isolde Hartwell's gift operated, but in the sense that when someone with word truth spoke, everyone present knew they were hearing something real. Serena had been using both gifts her entire life without knowing what they were, attributing her precise reading of people to careful observation, not understanding that she was perceiving things most wolves never could. Now she understood, and understanding them changed their quality, made them more accessible, more deliberate. "You have been doing this for 22 years without any framework for it," Tevin told her. "With a framework, you will be considerably more precise." "Is that a compliment or a warning?" Serena said. "Both," Tevin said, with the calm of someone who gave honest answers, regardless of their emotional valence. Serena liked her immediately and irrevocably. Isolde Hartwell arrived at the Northern residence on the 11th day. She arrived with a formal invitation from a territorial council member, which gave her legitimate grounds for presence, and an escort of 6 wolves who were technically her personal security and technically exceeded the accords. Hospitality provisions for non-royal visitors, but were within the range of what could be contested without certainty. She arrived wearing deep green and the gold chain at her throat, and the expression of someone who had made a decision that they considered both regrettable and necessary, which was the expression Serena recognized as dangerous, precisely because it was honest. Isolde was not pretending she was here for social reasons. Dorian received her formally in the main hall, with Serena present. This was a choice, Serena understood, that communicated something, that the Alpha King was not managing the inconvenience of the heir's presence by keeping her separate from his public engagements. Isolde looked at Serena with the specific quality of attention that Serena's deep sight translated immediately and precisely. Underneath the composed expression and the tactical courtesy, there was a woman performing a rapid reassessment of the situation. Isolde had expected to find a lost, frightened girl from Clan Voss who had stumbled into something too large for her and could be managed accordingly. She had not expected to find someone standing next to the Alpha King with the quiet ease of someone who belonged there. Serena watched Isolde's reassessment happen and smiled at her with warmth she did not feel, and said, "It is good of you to come. The Northern residence benefits from the presence of Clan Hartwell." It was exactly the right thing to say, courteous and inclusive, and it was also a statement of territorial sovereignty that Isolde could not miss, the acknowledgement that the Northern residence was a place where Serena had some standing to welcome or not welcome visitors. Isolde smiled back with warmth she also did not feel, and said all the appropriate things, and Serena listened to the words, and read the layer beneath them, and filed both carefully away. That evening, in the small room that had become her working space in the Northern residence, Serena was sitting with Tevin's documents when Dorian appeared in the doorway. He did not come in immediately. He stood in the doorway with the expression of a man who had come with something specific to say, and was choosing how to begin, and Serena looked up at him and waited. "Payne has called an emergency session of the Combined Council," he said. 10 days from now. He is citing procedural irregularities in the claiming ceremony preparation. Serena set down the document she had been reading. "What irregularities?" "He will specify them at the session. The Accord's provisions allow him to do this, and the timing of the session is within his authority to set." He came into the room then, and sat in the chair across from her desk, and she noticed that he sat in the chair the way he always moved through rooms, without using more space than necessary, without performing comfort. "He is moving faster than I anticipated." "He is moving fast because we are moving fast," Serena said. "He has seen the communications we have been sending to the council members. Not the content necessarily, but the activity. He knows we are building support, and he is trying to interrupt the process before it reaches its completion." "Yes. Then we need to be at the session," she said. Dorian looked at her. "The session is convened by Payne. He can limit who attends." "He cannot limit the Alpha King," she said. "He cannot," Dorian agreed. "But the session is designed to challenge the ceremony preparation, which means it is designed to challenge you specifically. Your presence there would be, politically, a risk." Serena looked at him across the desk. She thought about risk. She thought about what risk had meant for the first 22 years of her life, which was essentially theoretical, because when you had nothing, the risk of losing it was not a meaningful threat. But she was beginning to understand that she had always had something, that the nothing she had believed herself to be was a story. She had been told rather than a fact she had verified, and the proof of that was the mark still warm on her skin, and the gifts she was learning to use deliberately, and the Alpha King sitting across from her with all the weight of his authority, and all the careful thought he had given to keeping her safe, looking at her as though her answer to this question genuinely mattered to him. "I think," she said slowly, "that the people on those territorial councils who are still undecided will be moved by different things. Some of them will be moved by argument and documentation, which is what we have been building. But some of them will be moved by seeing something that they cannot dismiss. The royal mark cannot be faked. The gifts of the Ashvale bloodline cannot be performed. If I am in that room, and if Payne attempts to use procedural arguments to dismiss what is sitting in front of the council's eyes, I think that will move the people who are still calculating whether the benefit is worth the cost." Dorian was quiet for a long moment. "You are right," he said. "And I am aware that I am the last person who should be deciding whether the risk to you is acceptable." Serena looked at him. "Because I am the one taking the risk," she said. "Yes." "Then I am deciding," she said. "I am going to the session." He nodded. He did not argue. He did not manage. He simply accepted her decision as the decision of a person capable of making it, and she felt that acceptance land somewhere inside. Her that had not previously had a name, but which she thought she might be learning to call safety. Not the safety of being protected from things, but the safety of being trusted to make choices about your own life. "We have 10 days, he said. "We will use them." They used them. Every one of them. Long days and late evenings, letters and conversations, and the careful work of building something real out of the available materials, which were the truth of who Serena was, the documentation Dorian. And Tevin had assembled, and the specific capacity Serena was developing to speak to people in a way that let them hear what was real, rather than what was convenient. She spent time with the council members who were present in the Northern Residence's territory. 3 of them had arrived in the past week under various pretexts that were obviously strategic positioning, and she spoke with each of them not as a supplicant seeking their favor, but as a person with something genuine to say, and she watched with her deep sight the way the truth of what she said moved through them. Not compulsion, never compulsion, but the simple force of something real, finding its way into the space where people kept the things they actually believed. She also spent time with Dorian in ways that were not strategic. These were accidental at first, the overlap of 2 people living in the same building with adjacent working hours, and the discovery that the hours after the strategic work was done, and before sleep were hours in which both of them were still thinking, and found it useful to think aloud. The courtyard of the Northern Residence had a stone bench where she went sometimes in the evenings when the rain had stopped, and the stars were visible above the hill, and on the 4th night, Dorian was already there when she arrived, and they sat for a while not talking, and she found this more comfortable than she would have predicted, given that she had known this man for less than 2 weeks. "My father," he said eventually, looking up at the stars, "believed that the compact required the sacrifice of everything personal, that a king who wanted anything for himself was a king with a weakness. He spent his life eliminating weaknesses." Serena listened. "He was not wrong that wanting things creates vulnerability," Dorian said. "He was wrong about the remedy. The remedy is not to stop wanting. The remedy is to choose carefully." She looked at his profile against the night sky. "What do you want?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her, and his eyes in the starlight were not amber, but something darker and more direct. "I want the compact to survive," he said. "I want the territories to be well governed. I want the people in them to have what they need." He paused. "And I want to sit in this courtyard talking to you after the work is done." The last thing was said differently from the first things, not with less certainty, but with a different quality of it, The certainty of something personal rather than political, and Serena felt it move through her with the particular velocity of something true. She looked up at the stars rather than at his face, because she was still learning how to hold the weight of being seen by someone who had unsealed archives and crossed ceremonial halls and accepted her choices without managing them. And she was not yet certain that looking directly at that, while it was happening, was something she could do without losing the thread of her own composure. "I would like that also," she said, and she meant it. And she knew that he heard that she meant it, because word truth worked in both directions, in the speaking and in the receiving, and sitting next to someone else who understood what was real and what was performance was, she discovered, one of the most profoundly restful experiences she had ever had. The combined council session took place in the Accord's Great Chamber, a room in the central venue that was even grander than the grand hall where the mating auction had happened, with seating for the full complement of territorial representatives and a raised central floor where the presenting parties stood and were visible from every angle. Councillor Payne had arranged the space with the precision of someone who had used it many times and knew exactly how to position elements for maximum effect. He stood at the presenting position with 6 of his allies arranged in the gallery above, and when Dorian entered with Serena beside him and Tevin and Joss and the 2 advisors behind them, Payne's expression did exactly what Serena's deep sight had predicted it would do, which was perform calm while being anything but. Isolde Hartwell was seated in the gallery. Serena had known she would be. They acknowledged each other with the courtesy of 2 people who understood exactly what was happening between them and were choosing, for now, to conduct it within the available social forms. The session began, with Payne's procedural objections, which were detailed and technically proficient, and which Dorian's archivist had anticipated in their essential structure and prepared responses to. But the session was not ultimately going to be decided by procedural argument, and everyone in the room knew it, which was why every person there was watching not the argument, but the 2 people at its center, the Alpha King standing beside the woman with the royal mark, and what that combination meant for the world. They all lived in. Serena stood, and she breathed, and she let her deep sight read the room, which was a complicated room with many layers, the overt layer of procedural formality, the middle layer of political calculation, and underneath both of those, the layer that was simply human, the layer of people who had spent their lives within a system and were now looking at something that changed the system and trying to determine how they felt about that change. She read all 3 layers simultaneously, and she understood, with the clarity that had always been hers and was now deliberately hers, what was needed. When Payne reached the point in his argument where he was describing the irregularities in the claiming ceremony preparation, Serena stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. She did not reach for drama. She simply stepped forward to the presenting position and spoke. "What Councillor Payne describes as irregularities," she said, and her voice carried in it the quality. That word, truth always gave it. The quality of something landing directly rather than deflecting. Are the activities of a person who did not know she was an heir until 11 days ago and has been learning as quickly as she can. I do not apologize for the pace. I ask that you consider what the pace represents. She looked around the room, not performing eye contact, but making it individual and real. Each pair of eyes she met, receiving the specific acknowledgement of a person who had used her whole life to learn how to see people rather than through them. I spent 22 years in Clan Voss without knowing my name. I spent 22 years being useful rather than significant. I am not telling you this for sympathy. I am telling you this because every wolf in these 5 territories who has spent their life without institutional recognition, without power, without a seat at the table where decisions are made about them, deserves to know that someone who has shared that experience is standing in this room and carrying their understanding of it. That is what the royal mark represents to me. Not power for its own sake. The understanding of what it costs to be without it. The room was quiet. Not the silence of people holding their breath, but the silence of people thinking. The silence of calculation adjusting itself in real time. Payne spoke. His voice was controlled, and his argument was well constructed. and it addressed the procedural points with the expertise of someone who had been doing this for 15 years, and Serena listened to it and read the layer beneath it with her deep sight, and understood that he was now arguing from a position of diminishing confidence, not in his argument, but in his assessment of the room. The room had shifted. He could feel it, and she could feel him feeling it, and the council members in their seats could feel both of those things, and the quality of everyone's attention was changing. Dorian spoke then, briefly, with the precision that was his characteristic mode, confirming the documentation and its legal standing under the Accord's provisions. And when he finished, he did not look at Payne, but at the council. And what he said next was the thing that made the decision in the room, not his words, which were formal and correct, but the fact that he said it standing next to Serena, as though she was where she was supposed to be, as though the position she occupied was not provisional or under consideration, but simply true. The vote that followed was not close. It was 4 territories to 1, with Payne's own territorial representative abstaining rather than voting against, which was its own form of message. The claiming ceremony was formally approved. The date was set. Payne left the Great Chamber with his 6 allies, and his departure was the departure of a man who has suffered a significant defeat and is already calculating the next move. And Serena watched him go with her deep sight, reading the layer beneath his controlled expression. And what she saw there was not the end of the threat, but the reconfiguration of it. She filed this away. She would not celebrate the session as a victory before she understood what it meant for what came next. Outside the Great Chamber, in the corridor where the afternoon light came through the high windows and made the stone floor look warm, Isolde Hartwell stopped Serena. Dorian was 4 steps ahead and turned at the pause, but Isolde spoke quickly, quietly, in the tone of someone choosing to set aside the performance for a moment. "You surprised me," Isolde said. "I do not say that easily." Serena looked at her. Her deep sight read below the words and found something she had not expected, which was genuine assessment rather than tactical maneuvering. Isolde was not here to threaten or negotiate. She was here because she was a woman who had spent her life being the most capable person in most rooms she entered, and she had just watched someone else be more capable. And she was choosing, in this moment, to acknowledge that. "You have resources I do not have yet," Serena said, "and you have been using them in service of an outcome that will not, after today, be available to you. I think you know this." Isolde looked at her steadily. "I think," she said, "that I have been playing a particular game for a very long time, and I am now finding that the board has changed." She paused. "I do not know yet what that means for my next move." "When you decide," Serena said, "I hope you will consider whether there is a game worth playing that does not require someone to lose everything." She said it without judgment, and without the performance of generosity that would have made it strategic rather than genuine, and Isolde received it the way people receive things that are true, which is not always immediately, but deeply. Isolde nodded once and walked away, and Serena watched her go and thought that this was not the end of anything, but it was the change of a direction, and that changes of direction were the things that mattered most in the long run. Dorian was beside her. She had not heard him come back, but she was not surprised to find him there. "What did she say?" he asked. "That the board has changed," Serena said. He was quiet for a moment. "And Payne is recalculating," she said. "He is not finished. I do not want us to think he is." "I do not," Dorian said. "But today was necessary, and today was real, and I think we are entitled to take that seriously for a moment before we move to what comes next." Serena looked at him, and found that he was looking at her with the expression she had been learning, the unguarded one, the one that had something in it that was neither political nor strategic, but simply present. "One moment," she agreed. The claiming ceremony took place on the equinox, which was the traditional date for such rituals, 17 days after the council session, in the open air of the Accord's ceremonial ground, a circle of ancient stone set into the hillside above the central venue, where the wind came in from the east, and the light was clear, and the 5 territorial flags flew on tall poles at the circle's 5 points. The 5 territorial councils were present in their full complement for the first time in 11 years. The representatives of every registered clan were present. The ceremony had drawn the largest gathering of wolves that Serena had ever seen, and she stood at the edge of the stone circle in a dress that Mara had apparently been making in secret for the past week, deep blue like the Ashvale banners, but cut simply, without the elaborate ornamentation that ceremonial tradition would have allowed, because Serena had asked for something she could stand in comfortably and be herself in, and Mara had understood what that meant. The mark on her skin was warm again, not the warning warmth, and not the initial awakening warmth, but something different. The warmth of something that had fully arrived, that was present and real, and entirely itself. She stood at the edge of the stone circle, and breathed the eastern wind, and looked out at the gathering, and felt her deep sight reading all of them simultaneously. The texture of the crowd, the quality of the attention directed at her, which was various and complex and included skepticism and hope and curiosity, and the specific weight of people who have been told something impossible and are still in the process of determining whether they believe it. Dorian stood beside her and did not touch her, and was entirely present. The master of ceremony spoke the ancient words of the claiming, which were words that had been spoken at this stone circle for 600 years, and which Tevin had translated for Serena from the old language, so that she understood not just their ceremonial form, but their meaning. They were words about continuity and recognition, and the specific kind of authority that came not from force, but from genuine connection to the people and land being governed. They were words that said, in their ancient formal structure, that power which is not witnessed and claimed by those it affects is not legitimate, and that the ceremony existed not to grant authority, but to verify that authority which already existed in truth. When the words were spoken, the mark on Serena's skin blazed. She saw it happen from the outside. She saw the light of it visible even through the fabric of her dress, and she heard the sound that moved through the gathered wolves. Not a gasp, but something older and more involuntary. The sound of recognition that happens in the body before the mind has caught up. She felt the blazing, not as pain, but as the most complete version of the warmth she had been carrying for 17 days, as though something that had been held at partial brightness for her entire life had finally been given permission to fully illuminate. She looked at Dorian. He was looking at her. His expression, which she had spent 17 days learning to read, was the most open she had ever seen it, the unguarded expression at its fullest extension, and what was in it was not surprise, because he had believed in this from the beginning, but something that was perhaps the specific quality of being confirmed in something you have held with hope and uncertainty for a long time. Serena Ashvale, the master of ceremony said, and the name was new and not new simultaneously. The name of someone she had always been, and had only recently been given the language to inhabit. Heir of the royal line, verified by the lunar mark and witnessed by the 5 territorial councils and the registered clans of the Accord. So let it be known. So let it be known. The words carried across the stone circle and up into the clear equinox air, and out over the gathered crowd, and Serena stood in the center of all of it, and breathed, and was entirely present in her own life, in a way she had not previously understood was possible. Later, in the quiet that followed the ceremony, when the crowd had dispersed to the celebration that had been organized in the venue below, and the stone circle held only a few people, Dorian found her standing at the eastern edge, looking out over the land that spread below the hill in the amber light of the late afternoon. He stood beside her in silence for a moment. The silence was the comfortable kind, the kind they had learned in the courtyard under the stars. "How are you?" he said. "I do not know yet," she said. "I think I am still processing." "That seems appropriate," he said. She turned to look at him. The amber light was on his face, and made his eyes the color they were when they were warmest, the autumn leaf amber, and she thought about the long arc of what had brought them to this hill, the documents in the sealed archive, the moment in the grand hall, the 3 weeks of building something together in the northern residence. The courtyard conversations, and the council session and everything she had not known about herself at the beginning of this month and knew now. She thought about all of it, and she thought that it was a very large story for someone who had believed, until 17 days ago, that she had no story at all. "You chose me," she said, "before you knew for certain, before the mark appeared. You walked across that room on the basis of documents in an archive, and the possibility that they were true." "Yes," he said. "That was a significant act of trust," she said. "In information, and in yourself. And in you," he said. "I read those documents and I knew who you had to be, and I had to trust that what I knew was real before I had any proof that it was. That is always the hardest kind of trust." Serena looked at him and thought about trust and what it meant to give it and what it meant to receive it. And she thought about the 17 days in the courtyard and the conversation in the stone bench. Evening, and all the ways in which two people who had been navigating impossible circumstances together had somehow, in the middle of all of it, become the kind of people who wanted to be in the same courtyard after the work was done. "I would like," she said carefully, because word truth made it impossible for her to speak carelessly about things she meant, "to continue to learn what this is between us. Not the political arrangement. The other thing." Dorian looked at her for a moment. The expression was the full, unguarded one. "So would I," he said. She looked back out over the landscape in the amber light. "Then I think," she said, "we should begin." What happened in the weeks that followed was the beginning of an unraveling that Councillor Payne had apparently not fully anticipated. The documentation that Dorian and Tevin had been building for years was presented formally to the combined council in sessions that each lasted most of a day, and at the end of which the scope of what Payne had built became fully visible. It was not that he had committed crimes in the simple sense. It was that he had built a structure of influence so carefully integrated into the court's functioning that distinguishing his authority from the court's authority required exactly the kind of patient, granular documentation that Tevin had been quietly assembling for 8 years, presented together, organized by Serena's read of which council members needed which information in which order. The documentation made visible something that had been hiding in plain sight: the difference between a counselor who served the court and a counselor who had managed to make the court serve him. Payne resigned before the final council session concluded. He did it with the quiet dignity of someone who understood the exact moment when continuing was more damaging than conceding, and his resignation was the formal end of the immediate threat, though Serena communicated clearly to Dorian that the structural conditions that had allowed Payne to build his position would remain unless deliberately altered. And altering them was work that would take years, rather than weeks. "We have time," Dorian had said. "We do," she agreed. And they did, the two of them, the royal heir and the Alpha King. The woman who had learned to see people clearly in 22 years of being not quite seen herself. And the man who had spent 6 years making hard decisions and was now making the different, and perhaps harder decision of wanting something for himself. They had the time and the work, and the stone circle on the Equinox Hill, and the courtyard under stars, and all the slow, patient building of something real between two people who understood, each in their own way, the cost of things that were not real. In the courtyard of the northern residence, on an evening in early spring when the bare branches had finally made good on their promise and were beginning to show the first soft evidence of leaves, Serena sat on the stone bench with Dorian, and they were quiet together in the way they had gotten very good at being quiet together, a companionable quiet full of presence rather than absence. The mark on her skin was warm with the warmth she had come to think of as its resting warmth, the warmth of something fully alive and fully itself. The equinox came again. Serena went to the stone circle in the early morning before the rest of the court was awake, and she stood in the center of it and breathed the eastern wind and felt the mark warm on her skin and looked out over the 5 territories in the morning light, the land she had been born into the center of without knowing it. The land she was learning to be responsible to, with everything she had learned in 22 years of not knowing. And she felt something that had no single word in any language she knew. But that was the combination of belonging and purpose, and the particular satisfaction of someone who has finally found the shape of the life they were meant to live. She heard footsteps behind her, and she did not turn around, because she knew the sound of those footsteps, had memorized them in the corridors of the northern residence, and the stone floors of the Accords venues, and the garden paths where they walked in the evenings after the work was done. Dorian stood beside her, and looked out at the morning over the 5 territories. His shoulder was close to hers. The wind came in from the east, and the light was gold, and the circle of ancient stone held them both inside its circumference, and Serena thought that this was it, the thing she had not known she was waiting for in 22 years of waiting, not a person and not a position, and not the recognition of a court, but this specific quality of presence, being somewhere she belonged with someone who saw her clearly, and chose her deliberately, and stood beside her without requiring her to be less than what she was. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. And below them, the 5 territories were beginning their day in the gold of the equinox light, and above them, the Ashvale banners moved in the eastern wind, and the mark on Serena's skin was warm with the warmth of something fully, irreversibly awake. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?